15 million banana trees, planted not in the tropics, not in the lush valleys of Central Africa, but in the burning savanna of Burkina Faso. To the foreign press, it sounded like madness. Bananas in the Sahel? They mocked, laughing in Paris cafes and London boardrooms. Economists called it suicide. Diplomats whispered it was reckless. But to the people of Burkina Faso, it was more than fruit. It was defiance. For generations they had been told, you cannot resist the desert, you cannot feed yourselves, you cannot prosper without aid. And then, one young captain stood before them and declared the unthinkable. Every tree is a soldier. This is not just a tale of agriculture, it is about dignity. It is about a nation refusing to bow its head, and a people daring to plant freedom in the very soil that others said was cursed. So the question remains, can 15 million banana trees save a nation, or will the desert swallow their dream? Stay with us, because this isn't just another story, it's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and journey with us for an Africa that will never bow again. In the final months of 2022, when the dust storm still raged and the villages of Burkina Faso were marked by hunger and insecurity, a young man in uniform stepped forward with words that no one expected to hear. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, barely in his 30s, stood behind the national flag and declared, "We will plant 15 million banana trees across the savannah. Every seedling will be a soldier in our fight for survival. Every tree, a promise of sovereignty." It was not a quiet promise made in a closed room, it was a thunderclap. Families huddled around their radios, children in dusty classrooms pressed closer to hear their teachers repeat the number, 15 million. In a land where even millet and sorghum struggled against the desert winds, could bananas really grow? The answer from abroad came swiftly, and with cruel laughter. The Financial Times dismissed the announcement as economic suicide. A French broadcaster replayed the young captain's speech with smirks, branding it "La rêve fou, the mad dream." Analysts from Washington to Brussels lined up in television studios to warn of disaster. Bananas, they said, were thirsty crops, demanding irrigation, markets, storage, transport, things that Burkina Faso, in their view, could never provide. It was mockery dressed as wisdom. The world was certain that a poor landlocked nation had no right to dream. But inside Burkina Faso, something stirred. For decades, villagers had been told only what they could not do. You cannot resist the desert, you cannot feed yourselves, you cannot prosper without aid. These phrases had been repeated until they had become chains. And suddenly, a voice from their own soil was telling them something new. You can. In the capital city of Ouagadougou, university students began scribbling slogans on walls. If we can grow bananas, we can grow an economy. In Bobo Dioulasso, a radio host captured the spirit of the moment. For the first time, we are told not what we cannot do, but what we can. The mood shifted. Skepticism did not disappear, but alongside it came imagination. Farmers pictured the wide leaves of banana trees shading the soil, trapping precious rainwater. Mothers envisioned feeding their children with fruit grown from their own hands, instead of waiting for sacks of foreign grain. Young men and women dreamed of transport jobs, market stalls, food processing plants, a chain of opportunity sprouting from one crop. And so the mockery from outside met a growing determination inside. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, the sneers of international newspapers. On the other, the rising heartbeat of a nation that dared to believe it could reclaim its dignity. For elders who had lived through years of drought and the humiliation of dependency, the idea of 15 million banana trees was not only about food, it was about memory. They remembered how foreign companies had drained their gold mines, how foreign traders had set the price of their cotton. They remembered the long years when aid convoys arrived like lifelines, teaching their children that survival depended on outsiders. The banana, absurd as it sounded to the world, became a symbol that this cycle could end. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, sometimes called reckless, sometimes called naive, had chosen his symbol carefully. He knew the world would laugh. He knew diplomats would whisper. But he also knew his own people had been waiting for a vision bold enough to shake them awake. When planting began, it did not feel like ordinary farming. It felt like enlistment. Schools became nurseries where children watered seedlings each morning before lessons. Soldiers carried not only rifles but buckets and shovels. Women's cooperatives that had long been excluded from the great industries of cotton and gold were invited into the center of the campaign. Planting days turned into festivals, complete with drums, songs, and prayers. Each small grove of green leaves seemed to whisper, "The desert does not win today." The foreign press kept laughing. But in dusty villages and crowded cities, people began to see themselves differently. Not as dependents waiting for help, but as a nation on its feet. And so, part one of this story closes with a paradox. To the world, bananas in the Sahel were a symbol of failure waiting to happen. To the Burkinabé, they became a symbol of dignity, waiting to rise. On the surface, bananas seemed an impossible choice. They belonged to the tropics, not to the Sahel. To the critics, they were a thirsty fruit, doomed to fail under a merciless Sunday. Yet Captain Ibrahim Traoré saw something that others did not. He understood that bananas were not just fruit. They were a system, a living engine that could nourish, employ, and empower. The first advantage was speed. While tree crops like mango or cashew take years before they yield, bananas can produce fruit within 12 months. For a nation where hunger pressed daily against every household, waiting 3 or 4 years was unthinkable. The banana offered food on the table within a single cycle. Families could eat it fresh, slice and dry it under the Sahel sun, or pound it into flour for bread and porridge. This alone made it revolutionary. It was not a luxury crop for export only. It was food security in the hands of the poorest households. But food was only the beginning. Bananas opened doors to multiple markets. In the streets of Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso, vendors sold fresh fruit where imported produce had once been too expensive. In rural villages, bananas were dried and preserved, ensuring a buffer against the long, lean season. At a larger scale, bananas could be processed into chips, flour, or beverages, giving birth to small factories and jobs. Every layer of society, from farmers to traders to urban consumers, could find an entry point into this new economy. Even what outsiders dismissed as waste became wealth. The trunks and leaves of the banana plant, often discarded on plantations in richer nations, turned out to be rich in fiber and nutrients. Shredded and chopped, they became animal feed. For a country where livestock feed was costly and scarce, this was a quiet revolution. Chickens fed with banana stems laid more eggs. Goats produced more milk. Cattle fattened more quickly. Suddenly, one crop was feeding both people and animals. It was not only food. For security, it was economic efficiency. This cycle mattered deeply in a country long trapped by dependency. For decades, Burkina Faso's economy had leaned on cotton and gold. Cotton prices were dictated in faraway trading rooms in New York and London. Gold profits flowed to foreign corporations while villagers remained poor. These industries tied the nation to the whims of outsiders. Bananas, by contrast, offered flexibility. If exports faltered, the fruit could be eaten. If fresh markets slowed, dried bananas could be stored and sold later. Unlike gold or cotton, bananas belonged to the people who grew them. This was sovereignty rooted in the soil. And then there was the ecological genius of it all. Planting bananas in clusters created shade that shielded the soil from the brutal Sahel Sunday. Their broad leaves reduced evaporation, while their roots trapped rainwater and held the earth against erosion. Beneath their canopy, farmers could plant beans, peanuts, or onions. Each grove became a microclimate, a small oasis, where the desert was forced to retreat. It was as if each tree was not only a soldier in the fight for dignity, but also a shield in the war against desertification. Foreign analysts continued to insist that it was folly. They saw only water costs, not water savings. They saw only risk, not resilience. But on the ground, the people began to see something different. They saw possibilities. A mother in a small village looked at a sapling and imagined banana porridge for her child. A farmer saw leaves that could protect his onions from the Sunday. A trader saw the promise of a new stall at the market. Captain Traoré's mantra spread like a hymn. Every tree is a soldier. 15 million soldiers to fight hunger, poverty, and humiliation. His words thundered across radio waves, painted on walls, repeated in classrooms. Bananas had ceased to be just crops. They had become a national emblem, a weapon, a shield, and a promise. For the outside world, it remained a gamble. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was becoming destiny. Hope is a fragile thing, especially in a land where the desert has broken dreams for generations. The first months after the Great Planting carried the air of a festival. Schools had become nurseries, soldiers dug trenches, women's cooperatives trained in drying and preserving bananas. Drums echoed through villages as green leaves began to rise from the soil. To many, it felt less like farming and more like a campaign, the banana army marching into battle against hunger itself. But the desert is a ruthless enemy, and it struck back. The photographs were heartbreaking. Rows of seedlings shriveled in the dust, their leaves curled and brown. The Sahel sun showed no mercy, burning through fragile stems in days. When the rains came, they came violently, drowning young roots, only to vanish for weeks afterward, leaving the earth cracked and barren. Termites chewed through stems like paper. Goats and cattle strayed into unfenced fields, snapping seedlings in half. In some villages, entire fields were lost within weeks. The international press pounced. Parisian newspapers splashed mocking headlines. Desert bananas fail. On television in Washington and Brussels, analysts shook their heads and smirked. One commentator sneered. Agricultural suicide, this was predictable from the start. To them, the project had already proven what they had argued all along, that the desert could not be resisted, and that Burkina Faso had gambled on the impossible. Inside the country, the mood darkened. Families who had carried buckets of water at dawn now stood in silence before fields of death. Mothers whispered, "Did we waste our strength?" Fathers muttered, "Perhaps the foreigners were right." Children who had been taught that the banana tree was a symbol of freedom looked at the withered stems and asked, "Why did they die?" Hope, once raised, is harder to lose than hope never felt at all. And the weight of despair pressed heavily on the land. It was at this moment, when the dream seemed most fragile, that Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared. Cameras followed him as he traveled to the hardest-hit regions. He did not hide from failure. Instead, he walked into the fields where farmers stood with grief heavy in their hands. He bent down, pulled a brittle stem from the soil, and held it high for all to see. The plant was dry, lifeless, the very image of defeat. And then he spoke. "This one is gone, but another will stand. Sovereignty does not sprout in one season, it grows with persistence." Those words cut through the silence like thunder. Broadcast across radios, replayed on televisions, whispered in marketplaces, they transformed the meaning of loss. The dead trees were no longer signs of failure, they became symbols of the enemy itself, the desert they were fighting. Each shriveled plant was proof that the war was real. And if the desert struck once, the people would strike back twice. Foreign critics scoffed even louder. A European analyst sneered on air, "He is leading his people into delusion." Aid agencies repeated warnings that scarce water was being wasted. Economists said the country was pouring its energy into a dream that could never bear fruit. Yet within Burkina Faso, every insult became fuel. Every doubt was proof that sovereignty frightened the powerful. A young man told a reporter, "If they laugh, it means we are doing something they fear." So the project did not collapse, it hardened. The banana army regrouped, farmers replanted. Children carried water again, soldiers dug new trenches, women's cooperatives dried what little they could salvage. The campaign continued, not because the land was easy, but because dignity demanded it. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's defiance gave the nation a new mantra: failure is not the end, it is part of the war. And so the stage was set for the next chapter. Could determination alone defeat nature? Could a people's will, however fierce, keep millions of banana trees alive in a land designed by drought? Or would the desert, patient and merciless, eventually devour their dream? That question lingered like a storm cloud until science, innovation, and sheer persistence began to turn the tide. The turning point did not come from fiery speeches or mocking headlines. It came from science, sweat, and a stubborn refusal to give up. The banana army had suffered its first casualties, but the battle was not over. In laboratories and dusty fields, new allies emerged: agronomists, engineers, and villagers willing to try again. The National Research Institute introduced varieties of banana bread in East Africa. These were not the delicate Cavendish bananas familiar in European supermarkets. They were shorter, sturdier, tougher, bred to withstand drought. Their roots gripped the soil more tightly, their skins thicker, their fruit less vulnerable to sudden shifts in climate. They were not designed for beauty, they were designed for survival. Farmers learned to dig circular basins, known locally as seed pits, around each sapling. These pits captured rainfall, funneling every drop down to the roots instead of letting it vanish into the desert air. Families gathered dried grasses, stalks, even shredded maize leaves, laying them thick around the base of each plant. This mulch shielded the soil from the burning sun, trapping moisture longer, protecting fragile stems from collapse. Technology joined tradition. Local engineers, with the help of soldiers, began installing solar-powered drip irrigation systems in pilot villages. Instead of flooding entire fields, wasting precious water, the pipes carried it drop by drop directly to the roots. Even in the driest weeks, a steady trickle kept the plants alive. For the first time, families could look at their fields with confidence. Not every seedling would be lost to the sky. The results were dramatic. Where once survival rates had collapsed to 20%, new plots boasted 60, even 70 to 80% survival. In the language of farmers, this difference was the line between despair and hope. The transformation was visible. Where shriveled stems had once stood like gravestones, rows of broad green leaves now stretched toward the horizon. Children played in the shade of young groves. Women planted beans and peanuts beneath the canopy, harvesting vegetables even before the bananas bore fruit. Villages that had spoken only of hunger now spoke of surplus. As one farmer said with pride, "The desert has teeth, but now we have shields." Still, the outside world was unconvinced. International economists insisted the project would drain the country's fragile water reserves. "Bananas are thirsty," one London analyst declared. "In a country of drought, they will drink the future dry." Aid agencies warned that reservoirs would fail, that groundwater would collapse. They framed the effort as reckless populism, a leader gambling with hope while ignoring science. But the numbers told a different story. Fields shaded by banana groves lost nearly 50% less water to evaporation than bare ground. Mulched plots retained twice as much moisture. Villages that had once relied entirely on imported livestock feed now shredded banana trunks and leaves to feed chickens, goats, and cattle. Feed costs dropped by almost 40%, allowing families to raise more animals at lower cost. Manure from the livestock fertilized the banana fields, closing the loop in a cycle of resilience. For ordinary farmers, the proof was not in reports or graphs, it was in their stomachs, their pockets, their children's laughter. A woman named Miriam, head of a small cooperative, told a local radio station, "Last year, we had only dust. This year, I sold bananas and bought school supplies for my children. You tell me if that is failure." Her words carried more weight than the warnings of distant economists. Critics abroad had expected failure to break the spirit of the Burkinabé people. Instead, each obstacle produced an innovation, each setback became a strategy, each insult fueled determination. The banana army had survived its first battle with the desert, and it had done so not through charity, but through resilience. Now, the nation began to ask a bigger question. If bananas could endure, could they do more than feed families? Could they become the backbone of a new economy, a weapon not only against hunger, but against dependency itself? The world would soon see the answer. Because the banana army was about to march beyond survival into markets, trade, and transformation. By the third year, the green rows of banana groves no longer looked like fragile experiments. They looked like orchards alive, determined, stretching across lands that had once been surrendered to the desert. What began as survival was becoming transformation. The first to seize the opportunity were women. Across the countryside, cooperatives of 20 or 30 gathered in open courtyards, knives flashing in the sun as they sliced ripe bananas into thin strips. Laid out on woven mats, the fruit dried into golden chips within hours. Simple bags carried to markets in Bobo Dioulasso or Ouagadougou sold quickly. For many women, this was the first independent income they had ever earned. "Before we waited for aid," said AWA, a cooperative leader in Koudougou. "Now, we sell what we make with our own hands. I can pay for medicine. I can pay for my daughter's schooling. I no longer beg." Her words spread across the airwaves, echoing the truth that dignity could be harvested alongside food. Bananas were not just fruit, they were freedom. Trucks began to roll down dusty tracks carrying loads of bananas beyond village markets. Within 2 years, convoys were crossing into Mali and Niger, supplying consumers who had once depended on expensive imported fruit. Restaurants in cities crafted new dishes. Schools added bananas to their meal programs, feeding children with local produce instead of foreign donations. Then came the breakthrough moment. A cargo container labeled "Bananas of the Sahel product of Burkina Faso" arrived in Dubai. Buyers who had once mocked the very idea of desert bananas tasted the fruit and found it sweet, firm, competitive. Contracts multiplied. Soon, shipments reached Europe, marketed as exotic and resilient. Bananas grown where deserts used to reign. What had been ridiculed as impossible was now advertised as unique. The economic impact rippled outward. For decades, cotton had dominated exports, binding Burkina Faso to volatile. Global markets controlled elsewhere. Gold wealth had flowed outward to corporations, leaving little behind. Bananas offered something different. They were rooted in villages, traded by cooperatives, reinvested in communities. Profits paved roads, built wells, powered solar grids, funded schools and clinics, not by foreign donors, but by the hands of Burkinabé themselves. Youth, once restless and unemployed, launched small businesses, banana flour, banana beer, even animal feed. Women invested in sewing machines, grinding mills, tools for independence. The cycle was visible, sovereignty feeding sovereignty. And beyond economics, bananas reshaped identity. Villages once known for scarcity now hosted harvest festivals. Drums thundered through the night as children danced, waving bunches of fruit like banners. Artists painted banana groves on walls. A new banknote carried the image of orchards beside the flag. Songs of the banana army played on community radios, turning agriculture into anthem. International corporations that had laughed now scrambled to protect their market share. Neighboring countries sent delegations to learn. Across Africa, headlines called it the Banana Revolution. But for the people of Burkina Faso, the meaning was even deeper. As one farmer said at a celebration, holding a ripe bunch high, "This tree is our mother, it feeds us twice, once with fruit, once with fodder for our animals." It was no longer just a crop. It was a covenant, a living promise that dignity, once planted, could not be uprooted. From ridicule to resilience, from dust to dignity, the story of 15 million banana trees has become the story of a nation refusing to bow. What began as mockery has grown into a revolution. Today, in the savannas of Burkina Faso, green orchards stretch where dust storms once ruled. Families who once feared hunger now harvest fruit for their tables, their markets, even for ships bound for Dubai and Europe. Livestock thrive on banana stalks and leaves, producing more milk, more eggs, more meat than ever before. Women's cooperatives earn steady income. Children study with books bought from banana profits. Villages light their nights with solar grids paid for by their own hands. This is what sovereignty looks like, not a slogan, but a mother feeding her child from her own soil, a father earning from his labor, a people trading with dignity. Yes, the desert still comes. Droughts return, storms strike, pests invade. But the people of Burkina Faso have changed. They have tools, confidence, and above all, faith in themselves. "We cannot command the rain," one farmer said, "but we can command our trees, and our trees protect us." For Captain Ibrahim, often called reckless by his critics, history now tells a different story. His gamble has become a legacy. His defiance has become a blueprint. His banana army has proven that sovereignty does not grow from aid, but from imagination, persistence, and the courage to plant freedom with your own hands. And so the question stretches beyond one nation. If 15 million banana trees can transform Burkina Faso, what could an entire continent achieve if it chose sovereignty over dependency? What could Africa become if every seedling, every farmer, every dreamer stood together? If you believe this is the dawn of a new Africa, say it in the comments. Africa rise. Africa can do it. It's time for Africa. And if this story moves something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Now it's time to speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear.